year that WFE has recognized a leader of the financial world for excellence. For those of you who don't know, in 2009, the first year that we had this award, we gave the award to Professor Robert Schwartz of the Baruch School in New York City for his work in market structure, particularly stock market structure. In 2010, the award was given to Ben Briggen of Sweden for his groundbreaking work in the creation of the first demutualized stock exchange. And last year, we gave the award to the United Kingdom's Mervyn King, who was the chairman of the IIRC, for leading a national commission on corporate governance. For 2012, it's my honor and privilege to present the WFE Award for Excellence to my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Richard Sandor. Richard's been a pioneer, been an innovator, an accomplished academic, and an entrepreneur in making the futures markets of the world better, more transparent, and certainly innovative. Richard earned his PhD at the University of Minnesota in economics. He then went on to teach at Berkeley during the turbulent early 70s. He was then lured to Chicago to become the first economist in the futures exchange world at the Chicago Board of Trade. And early on, he conceived and developed interest rate futures contracts, first the Ginnie Mae future, and then the phenomenally successful long bond or treasury bond futures contract. Today, many of the exchanges in the world, the most active futures contract group is interest rate futures, trading on dozens of exchanges around the world. Later, Richard established the first exchange for trading of climate emissions, first in Chicago, called the Chicago Climate Exchange, and then in 2005, he founded the European Climate Exchange, which today is the leading exchange in the EU for the trading of emissions and is the world's benchmark for carbon trading emissions. As Peter just told you, he just published his book, Good Derivatives, and thanks to Richard, we were able to distribute a copy to every delegation of every exchange that's a member of the Federation. The title Good Derivatives is very apt. In fact, he recently authored an article in our publication on LIBOR and why the LIBOR scandal has helped give certain derivatives a bad name. And his concept is there are good derivatives and there are bad derivatives. But I want to quote from the book, for those of you who don't have it, or should at least try to find it. He says in the preface, good derivatives, those listed on regulated exchanges, create value for society and prevent systemic breakdown of financial institutions and capital markets. The transparency of futures prices on regulated exchanges results in lower transaction costs in the purchase and sale of commodities, stocks, bonds, and other things. These are the things that we talk about all the time. Then he talked about the crisis that we've been living through for the last 4 or 5 years. And he says something else that we've been talking about for the same period. He said there were no regulated exchanges in markets that required bailouts by governments during the Great Recessions. Good derivatives, and of course we could say stocks and bonds as well, performed flawlessly. So we're all on the same page, and it's nice to have a book that talks about exactly what WFE stands for. So let me say that we as an organization are thrilled to bestow this award on Richard, and I'm honored and privileged to be able to be the one to present it to you. So Richard Sandor, would you please come up and accept the award from the WFE?
Thank you. I guess it really doesn't get any better than this, to be among peers, people in your industry, to have worked 40 years in the field and to feel that you've better helped those in your industry, and to be introduced by a dear friend, 30-odd years, and to have my wife and daughter, my younger daughter who is not here but here in spirit, all having made it possible. We're getting a bad rap in finance these days, and that bad rap is, I think, not fair. If we take a look at recent remarks by Paul Volcker, he felt the only good financial innovation in the last 50 years was the ATM. Not exactly a ringing endorsement of our business. Smart man, but Paul, you got to get a little closer to what's happening. Joe Stiglitz won a Nobel Prize in economics, and Joe said he could find no value whatsoever in any derivative. I think a slip of the tongue. Why does this happen? And let me give you some hypotheses, spend about 5 or 10 minutes on some thoughts and where we are. Anybody in the audience heard of Henry Ford? Everybody? Anybody heard of Luca Pacioli? By the way, he's not the lead in The Godfather. Didn't play in any movies and doesn't make people sleep with fish. Anybody know who Luca Pacioli is? One. It's fantastic. It normally isn't the case. I would argue that, and I'll talk to you after, or maybe you'll ask a question, but the point is that I would hypothesize that Luca is far more important than Henry Ford. He is the father of accounting, okay? And there would be no Renaissance, no Michelangelo, no development, and nobody knows him. We don't even know who came up with the notion of an exchange. One started in 1605 in Amsterdam. And we don't know who invented the limited liability corporation. And perhaps all of the economic development of Europe and the United States would have not occurred had we not had these financial innovations. That's a hypothesis. Now, why don't they get advertised? Why don't we know anything about their history? There's 3 reasons, okay? And these 3 reasons generally are that they are wholesale and not retail products. People know what an Apple is, what a Ford is. They don't know what goes on behind the curtains. Number 2, all of you as colleagues know that innovation is collaborative. Okay, it requires a lot of different actors, just like a film, and it's hard to come up with the concept of the auteur and what the auteur means. And the third part, they generally have not been either patentable or trademarkable, but that is changing these days. So that is one of the reasons. These good derivatives, since I've been in the business over the last 40 years, have grown dramatically. In 1970, we traded 13.7 contracts million in the United States, and virtually that represented the worldwide volume. By 2010, it grew to 21.3 billion contracts, a compound annual growth rate of 18.3% a year. Larger than everything in the United States or in the world, save high technology and chip capacity. It grew because of electronics, but most importantly, it grew from new products. In 1970, no currency derivatives, no stock options, no interest rates, no equity indices, no energy. Every single product, okay, drove that, and no ETFs in the equity world. And where would we be if those products never occurred? The market cap of the exchanges, and if you take just the US side, CME Group, ICE, CBOE, you get a market cap of 35 billion. The total capitalization of the U.S. airline industry is $24 billion. So the derivatives exchanges in North America are bigger than the airlines. No bailouts, no bankruptcy, no federal money, performing, as Bill said, flawlessly. The benefits come, in this case, from several factors, at least in the derivatives world, but many of them really apply to the stock exchange world as well as the derivatives. In the case of derivatives, they perform a function of risk transfer, most importantly. And that risk transfer function occurs in a regulated, transparent market. The transparency has subsidiary benefits associated with prices in primary markets. You crush the spreads in the futures market, it has a big spillover in the spot market, and so we have enormous liquidity benefits. Price discovery, which I would not put as the same thing as liquidity, that is the prices that are forecast in the future for crops, for metals, for all kinds of, for bonds, for short-term interest, and even for equity indices. And to do all of this, and I'll make a statement which is controversial, and I understand in the world of political correctness it may not be the right approach, this requires speculation. And speculation is a good thing if it's regulated, controlled. And let me say that there is a difference between speculation and gambling. And it's important that you, as leaders around the world, emphasize this. In the case of gambling, there is no risk until you build the racetrack or the casino. It's manufactured risk for leisure time purposes. In speculation, soybeans go up and down, stocks go up and down, interest rates go up and down, and currencies, they're there. The question is, who assumes them, and for how long do they assume them? And sometimes it's good for speculators to, others it's not. Let me say that perhaps the biggest speculators in the world are private equity and venture capital firms. We don't seem to get upset when Stephen Jobs gets rid of his financial risks and gets outside investors in a highly risky prospect in 75 or 80, or Bill Gates does that when they shift the financial risk to speculative capital so they can assume the technological risks and develop their own products. So we have to understand that role. Whether we now, because it's politically correct, call it liquidity providers, market makers, because it suits us better, but let's not forget that the people who are trading these markets are no different than the people who provided capital to all of the venture companies and a lot of the technological development. Let me talk a few minutes about where they go. We don't seem to worry about speculation and markets and good and bad derivatives with food. We're having the biggest drought in the country in the longest period of time. There's no problem with markets. They're functioning and performing and getting to their highest and best possible use. The same thing with energy. And let me go to the Ginnie Mae futures and give you an example of the benefits. What are the benefits? In 1970, when Ginnie Mae's as a security started, it's a fixed income instrument that's backed by FHA VA mortgages. The bid-ask spread was 2 points in the dealer market. The bonds were 98 bid, offered at 100. By 1973, they had been collapsed to a point, and in 74, they had collapsed to 3/4 of a point. We listed futures, and within 3 weeks, the spread started to narrow, and within 6 months, we're 32nd. We talk in listening to everybody here about the value of liquidity, but let me put it in practical terms what that means. That collapse of the Ginnie Mae spread from 3/4 of a point to a 32nd means that the average American paid $6,000 less over the life of his or her mortgage. Okay, big difference. Bill, a 10-year security in '82 traded with an eighth to really a quarter spread. At that time, sadly to say, the U.S. had issued something like 22 billion of 10-year notes. Sad to say, we issued 24 billion a month this year, as opposed to the total issuance of 200 years of 20 billion. What does that collapse of the spread mean from an eighth or a quarter to a 32nd or a half a 32nd? To the U.S. government, it means $500 million less in interest costs. And to pension funds, to life insurance companies, to anybody who invests in the 10-year space, it saved $10 billion in transactions costs. So it's $10 billion for retirees, etc. So just a clarion call, when we speak of liquidity in this business, we have to think of the benefit to the homeowner, to the pensioner, not talk about transactions costs and liquidity, but bring it down to a point that's understandable by a regulator and is basically can be communicated in the popular press. This is very, very important. Let me go to, and it's a nice segue from the last panel, and spend a few minutes talking about environmental derivatives. In the United States, we had a problem with acid rain. In the 1980s. There were movies made by Michael Douglas called Black Rain. It was a metaphor for everything evil that you could imagine. It plagued New York State and New England. It was drifting from the Soviets over to the Baltic states and into Western Europe. It was impossible. We came up with something called cap and trade. So you lower emissions across the board by 10%, but then if Bill or Andreas is a lot better than I am in reducing pollution and can go to 20 to 30%, because he can modify his boilers, change the way he burns fossil fuels, but I can't, because I don't have enough land, I have to build a new technology. I can buy the excess reductions, okay, and satisfy it. Society will be the same, but in fact, emissions reductions will be done at the least cost to the economy. Very complex tool, something the U.S. Congress thought was very, very difficult. You couldn't explain it. This is a 5th grade class that brought up SO2 permits in a Board of Trade auction. The teacher taught the class cap and trade by creating chewing gum rights. And each student was given a certain right to chew gum for 3 hours a day. If they didn't want to chew gum, they could sell their rights to students that wanted to chew more gum. So the 5th grade class seemed to get cap and trade, and it's having a great deal of difficulty into a process of the regulators and the politicians understanding that. How did the program do? We went from that terrible situation of 18 million to 3 million tons. That saves annually $123 billion in lung disease medical expenses and saved 32,000 lives last year. The whole program cost $2 billion. This is the poster case of how markets can deal with environmental problems. So much so that acid rain has disappeared as a problem in the United States. Nobody talks about it. and cap-and-trade is fully hated among our leaders after the most successful program of its time. Let me talk to, in the last 5 minutes, some thoughts and just some random things so I keep on the budgeted time that Bill allowed. Following the ESG program, as a result of the acid rain, we got called down to Rio in 1992 and were asked, look, you worked on acid rain, is it possible to apply this to climate change and global warming? And I said, yes, as the people who know me, and Bill and Andreas, Tom Chloe, I generally have been thrown out of most nice places for the last 40 years. I got thrown out of every New York bank that told me I ought to go back to Berkeley because interest rates don't fluctuate. I got thrown out of almost utilities that told me this was a stupid idea, they could clean it, trading would never work. You could never commoditize air. So, as my same persistent self said, this global warming can be done by the exchange community. I have a simple attitude. I like to crash into a wall, fall down, assess the damage, and then crash into the wall at the same time, and then fall down, assess the damages, and re-crash into the wall. We came up and eventually to develop a private program, and we looked at it the same way we looked at all financial innovations. You look at the gains from trade, how much is gained, and then you look at the costs, and the costs are legislative, regulatory, the cost of the institution, and the cost of a transaction. So you have to minimize those 4 costs, and they have to be less than the gains. So we started a voluntary market for carbon, and this is somewhat relative to what we're speaking about. And everybody, or a lot of people, said, you could never do that. Nobody is going to enter into a private contract to reduce emissions where there are no laws. And we got these companies to commit to reducing emissions by 6% with no federal law. They volunteered, IBM, Intel, United Technology, Honeywell, Ford. They not only volunteered to do it, they cut emissions by 400 million tons more than France does in a year, all on a voluntary program working together. Let me kind of conclude with some 3 or 4 thoughts. Number 1, price is a very important signal. We traded carbon at $1 or $2. We had a project, and Robbie, I think, knows about it, in rural India, where people who took animal waste, put it in a kind of a garbage can, the methane floated to the top. You take a copper tube, run it from that casing into a house, and cook with it. We got 3,000 rural poor to join the program. They made $24 a head in the poor. They stopped 7-year-old girls from foraging for wood and allowed them to go to school. The program expanded to 10,000 the following year, 25,000 subsequently, and before we sold the exchange, there were 100,000 rural poor, such that there would be an actual ceremony in the village in which the CCX, the Chicago Climate Exchange, changes, checks would come and would be cashed. But it evolved that they didn't even cash the checks, and they could use them to buy groceries. So carbon credits became the currency in Kerala, the poorest province in India. So how powerful is price? When set in a regulated, transparent way, it changes lives, and it has the power to not only allocate capital, but make people's lives better. Couple of random thoughts. Okay, I believe in regulation. I've spent 40 years in a regulated environment, but I believe in good regulation. The U.S. Constitution is 6 pages long. The bill creating the Federal Reserve is 25 pages. The bill creating the CFTC is 150 pages. Dodd-Frank is over 2,000 pages. It is longer than the New Testament, the Old Testament, and the Quran combined. Does that strike you as reasonable? Okay. Second observation. Rating agencies, the cure or the problem? Is it a good model where I pay you to judge me? Will that get rational results? Last year we had 4 countries in the United States that were AAA, 14 countries in the world that had AAA ratings, and from 2000 to 2008, Moody's and S&P rated 16,900 securities as AAA. Does that sound right? 4 companies, 14 countries, 17,000 securities. Random thought, where's the next big problem? The United States is an economy of $16 trillion, and all of the property and casualty risks associated with earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, okay, have only $550 billion in capital. Hurricane Irene, which almost hit New York, could have wiped out the entire capital. The rational policy in America is to go to California, go to the San Andreas line, find the highest risk place you can, and write all the quake insurance you get. Because either you live long enough to keep the premiums, or then, if there's a big earthquake, you hand it to the state of California and you say, thank you, okay? Because no governor of any state is going to leave a homeowner during a catastrophic period uncovered for homeowner insurance. Maybe somebody should look at a capital requirements in a property casualty business. Remember, if that big one occurs, what happens to the bond market, the stock market, to all of the portfolios, the municipal market? You will roil everything, and nobody seems to be concerned about that. Let me kind of, to finish, if I can, to talk about the future and conclude with that remarks and just some observations. Cap and trade is now being adopted all around the world. Europe is the premier and the leader. China announced 7 special exchanges. Guangdong is just starting. They'll have 1 billion tons, half the size of Europe. India has 3 trade provinces that will do that. Mexico has announced it's looking at it. Vietnam has floated an idea. It's looking at it. Korea's parliament has passed it successfully. Australia is looking at links with the EU. And it's nowhere in the United States. Brazil is also a pilot program in Rio. So while the developing world is heading to market-based solutions, at least North America is not. Okay, and I believe the developing world is right. Let me talk about the last sentence and the last thing. Where are the opportunities? You're going to get 18% a year for the next 40 years. You won't get it out of existing products. You'll get it the same way that we did before. And where does the opportunity lie? I think water will be the commodity of the 21st century. More important than oil, more important than anything else. We've learned that environmental programs can be worked well if they're handled by people like yourselves, regulated markets, that's thing. What else can they be? Where are the problems that occur? Medicine, okay? There's a role for markets in medicine. There's a role for markets in education. Now, we have the ability to turn all of our attention to the most pressing environmental and social problems and to have all of you prosper from that and provide social and environmental objectives. I wear the hat that I'm wearing as an homage to my father, as an homage because you can't get up on the stage not wearing a white hat if you're talking about good derivatives. It's a metaphor. But most importantly, derivatives, markets, ETFs, exchanges are like hammers, okay? They can be used to bash somebody's skull in, or they can be used to build houses, okay? All of you in regulated exchanges, spot and futures, you build houses and continue to do so for the next 40 years. Thank you all very much.